Hello and welcome to another edition of The World Today. My guest is Karma Nabulsi, who is a Palestinian activist of long standing, an academic, an essayist, and teaches politics at St. Edmund's Hall in Oxford. Karma has been one of the most courageous voices in recent months, speaking up against the surveillance and semi-spying operations carried out by the British government under the title of Prevent. The notion being that spying and surveillance and getting information regarding Muslim families will somehow magically deal with the problem of terrorism, which of course has been tried before with other ethnic minorities, the Irish during the Irish Troubles, and has never worked. Nothing has worked except a political solution of some sort. Karma, welcome. We're very happy to have you with us. Before we get on to Palestine and Prevent and other issues, tell me a bit about yourself. When did you come here? When did your parents move? What are your origins in Palestine?
The Nabulsi family is a city family. The majority of Palestinians are from the countryside. Peasants come from a particular village. But us city folk are from more than one town. So the Nabulsis are from Nablus, which is now in the West Bank, Jaffa, which is on the coast of Palestine, in 48 Palestine, and actually Jerusalem. So we have three branches of the family. So some of my parents, grandparents' generation went in 48 to Lebanon. So we're a refugee family from 48.
From Jerusalem?
From
the three?
Jaffa.
From Jaffa.
Yeah. So I grew up in Beirut. In fact, my father studied for a doctorate he's got a scholarship to America. So we moved there for a few years when I was a child, moved back. But I also came to school in Britain when I was a child. When I was 17, I joined the Palestinian movement. It was during the Lebanese Civil War. All of my school friends were joining the Lebanese national movement, which took in the broad, progressive alliance of all like-minded who were fighting fascism against the Phalangists, who were a fascist organization. So that was in the mid-70s. That was when I was 17. The crisis of Palestine means that there's an urgency that you feel every day. And the only thing that I thought was, how do I serve? How do I get involved? So I began in the revolution. It was really the last decade of the revolution, I would think. And so I had a great fortune because it was a remarkable political education. I went to university at 34. I'd only done 1 year of my university, so I came with this great political experience of popular struggle that was a real guide and real education, and which taught me everything that I know about politics.
So you learned from the University of Life, as we say.
Indeed. I remember someone once told me, you will never see anything as beautiful as a people struggling for their freedom. And it's true, I feel in a sense, although the predicament is so desperate and so baffling and mysterious, why it's gone on, this tragedy, for so long, I also feel incredibly fortunate to be amongst a struggling people, because the principles and the power of all of these ordinary people that you work with, that I've had the luck to work with, their bravery, their intelligence in organizing resistance to injustice, has been a great, I felt really lucky in that way.
What year did you come to Britain?
I came as a PLO representative in the mid-'80s, Thatcher, the miners' strike, Labour and opposition. So I got to know the Labour Party and the trade unions very well. I would travel on a Friday. I traveled across the country speaking at the MPs' meetings or the trade union meetings, and I found a great internationalism. I have to say, the further north I went, the better it was. And I could have just lived in Scotland, because their understanding and sympathy and true solidarity, internationalist solidarity, was quite remarkable. They really understood the Palestinian story and what we were fighting for.
And they're still pretty strong on
Yes,
that.
yes. You know, that's the thing that you see with Palestine. You can see the worst and you can see the best. And one thing that you do find, or I found, is that the people are with us across the world. You have always ordinary people, people that get it right away and support and come around Palestine.
Karma, the Palestinian movement, the Palestinian people, the Palestinian organizations have been through more hardships in a certain sense than almost any other national liberation movement I know. I mean, if you just look at it chronologically, from 1948 to 2017, where we now are, the attacks, the sustained denunciations of the Palestinians, the killings, the murders, the checkpoints. And yet, in a way, despite all the problems, the people, the Palestinian people haven't given up. I don't now speak about the leaderships.
Oh, no.
I talk about the ordinary people. They have not given up, but they fight against terrible odds.
You know, our people are young. I always say our leaders are old, and we don't really have a national liberation movement anymore in that sense. I would say since 1982, really.
Yes.
Since the comprehensive destruction and the invasion of 82. But our people are young. You know, the majority of our people are under the age of 20. And we are a people outside of just the West Bank and Gaza, which is what they'd like to reduce us to. So we have the majority of our people being a refugee people are outside Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, across the world, Chile. You know, in Latin America, we have a great many Palestinians. But our people haven't given up. They are absolutely strong on the two principles. I would say there's only two principles. One is liberation of the land, and the other is the return to that land from which we were expelled in 48. So these two principles means that the young people I meet, you know, you can get very depressed looking at the PA in Ramallah and the gruesome behavior, which doesn't help. You know, whatever they do, it doesn't really help. But if you meet our young generation, it's so encouraging because their hearts are on fire. They're the same like I was when I was young. They're as committed to the principles of those liberation and return.
But when you were young, there was greater hope. The movement hadn't been defeated till the early 80s. And even after that defeat, there was still an element of hope. And the leaderships of the PLO and Hamas was still respected, though people were beginning to get nervous. So that, all that was still there. I mean, I think Edward Said was right in a way when he said that the Oslo Accords more or less finished off the idea of a Palestine national movement fighting for its liberation because of the extent of the capitulation, which the Israelis never kept any of their promises, which were promised at the table. I mean, one has to say that to start off with.
Absolutely.
All that was nonsense. And they kept on, you know, salami tactics, chopping the Palestinians, their territories, their lands, building these ugly surveillance settlements, you know, from where they looked on the Palestinians, carrying out murders. So how do you explain the fact that there is still, if not hope, there is still enthusiasm?
The idea that we have a popular cause, and so it's a people's cause, is where you get the real strength. Because, you know, what the project, the colonial project of ethnic cleansing before 48, but also after, is to disperse us. So we could not unite. So we could not struggle for our cause. So we've been pushed into Gaza, in the West Bank or Jordan or elsewhere, but to disperse us under different regimes, to control us so that we couldn't unite as a people. And that roof of the PLO as a liberation organization could unite people from a variety of ideologies under a roof, because we were dispossessed of the land, but at least we could struggle together. And I think that desire to come together as a people to advance our cause means that in the end, a national movement is inevitable. I think it's inevitable. You know, a lot of people have moved on. They talk about a post-colonial society or post-colonial problems even. We're still in the colonial predicament.
Yeah.
We're still in the colonial predicament. And in a sense, only a revolution has the form that can answer the colonial predicament, which is facing asymmetrical power. If you're facing the tanks and the guns and the aircraft and the Americans, what do you have as a people, you know, except popular sovereignty? And
a moral superiority.
Yes, and that sense of the people have the right to self-determine. So, you know, Oslo came about, I think, was a design to take away our chances. But I would say it was already a reflection of our weakness. Yeah.
The weaknesses had been visible long before Oslo.
Yes, yes, absolutely.
That was the culminating point. But the interesting thing is this, that despite the fact that the Israelis, from their point of view, the hardcore Zionist establishment that now runs Israel, have had so many successes. You know, they've done this, they've done that, they've occupied more and more lands, and yet they're so panicky and nervous at the thought of two things. One, a non-violent mass movement within the Arab lands, the occupied lands in Palestine, and secondly, an international solidarity movement. So one thing which I think has probably been one of the biggest successes has been BDS.
Yeah.
The boycott, divestment, sanctions movement, which has taken large parts of the world by storm. I mean, you know, in South Africa, it's semi-official. In other parts of the world, it's not official, but many councils, local bodies are voting for it. So now they want to make BDS illegal, with the Americans in the lead and the Europeans not far behind, with this, the British government doing its best. The ending of apartheid in South Africa was, of course, the result of a two-pronged thing, i.e. the struggle at home. Secondly, the Cubans' internationalism by coming into Angola and smashing the South African army. And thirdly, the solidarity movement abroad. The first two are virtually excluded as far as Palestinians are concerned, but the third is there. What do you think is the possibility of a sustained, non-violent civil disobedience movement, both inside Israel, where there is still a significant Arab population, Palestinian Arab population, and in the other territories?
Well, I think that there has been a struggle going on. Our prisons are full of our young men and women, inside occupied Palestine. You can see it in Jerusalem. You can see it in people being arrested every week. I've had a friend arrested last week, but constantly our young people struggling in non-violent ways because the coercion and the oppression of the occupier is so extreme that it surrounds any activity. Equally, you have Palestinian refugees who have been in a terrible predicament in Syria, on the boats to Europe or having their camps destroyed, who are also struggling for their human rights. And so I think the great thing about BDS as a solidarity tactic is that it's also an awareness about what the injustices are. BDS is a tactic that should be used that helps solidarity explain why they stand with people struggling against injustice. It explains about the occupation. It explains about that the Israelis do not allow the right of return. It explains about the discrimination against the Palestinians inside 48. So by doing that, and what you see is quite remarkable, as you said, the governments in the West are getting increasingly frightened by it, under pressure, but you see this young generation of activists like Students for Justice in America, who are a Jewish organization, young Jewish university students taking the front line in advancing BDS. So this alternative of what the world can be like and should be like, it means, and this solidarity of we will stand with the Palestinians in their struggle in this popular way, like you said in South Africa and others, is so important to Palestinians now, so important, because we become so invisible in the Western media. There's always a concerted attempt to make this disappear. You began by talking about how the Israeli government is so anxious about this nonviolent tactic, which is a consumer tactic. It's very straightforward. It's got a very, very long history throughout the 20th century and before, as you know. And that's because it's not coherent and sustainable. This extent of human rights abuse and this impunity, they know that this is not sustainable. When my father's generation grew up, when even myself, you had Jews and Muslims and Christians living on your street. To have a return of refugees doesn't mean annihilation, the way it's explained. It should be welcomed. There is these other kinds of ways of being. And I think that BDS also points to that, and I think that is why it frightens the regime. Yeah.
The Israeli tactics of blackmailing selected Palestinian militants, locking them up, training them to be spies, of course, partially it works because no one wants to be tortured, no one wants their families to be hurt. But in reality, it doesn't work. It increases the hatred for people who carry through these tactics. But so there is a link between that style of spying, creating spies, having information given to you. There is a link between that behavior by the Israelis. It's actually traditional colonial behavior.
That's right.
Every colonial state has carried it out, but it's now moving back home. I mean, in France, in Germany, in Britain, they won't give us the figures, but I am pretty sure there are tens and tens of thousands of young Muslims who've been recruited to work for the intelligence agencies, more than are members of terrorist organizations. Yes. I always make this contrast. And it doesn't work because they don't get it. They just do not understand what the problem is. You wrote a very powerful essay on the mechanisms of PREVENT, which is surveillance, effectively, in Britain. What was it? Was it a particular incident that really moved you and aroused your anger?
I think it was the definition of what is extreme and therefore dangerous. And this understanding that's being introduced and has been introduced over these last few years really has a neocon ideology around it. And you can see the suppression of dissent and the colonial racism, which is profiling culturally, ideologically, religious, of immigrant communities. So racialized Muslims, immigrants, refugees, anybody who's progressive and doesn't have what is considered the accepted view of the government of the day. When these are considered extreme, then the logic that they're using, which has been proved false, is that extremism leads to violent extremism, which leads to terrorism. So this is the conveyor belt theory, which has been disproved. But what that means is that people that say things that make you uncomfortable are suspicious and dangerous. It's a control, it's a surveillance. Yeah? So you can see exactly in here, we started talking about Palestine and about the colonial project there. Many of the laws that they're using are British colonial laws. Demolishing of houses, many of the practices. It's that, how do you control a subversive, or what could be a subversive community? And it's those colonial practices which are being brought in. So having grown up and in an anti-colonial movement when I was, and seeing colonialism in that way, seeing it here, you can see the racism behind it, and the colonialism behind it that is so invisible that people are being told, this is how you catch terrorists. It has turned ordinary people into police spies. They're also told that they're meant to identify what is extreme. So people that are religious, who are the last people, Muslims that pray and are very conservative religious, that's the last people that you would be looking for. But to someone who doesn't know, they're encouraged to be worried and fearful. So it's what I call a division-making machine. We have a class system here. We have a lot of racism here. Where does that come from? That division-making machine is why Prevent has been able to be embedded as a system rather than, completely rejected. Yeah? The teachers are actually the National Union of Teachers, and many other sectors of our society have protested this. This is not how you do policing. This is not how you do any kind of addressing of political injustices and inequalities. This is how you accelerate them.
But Karma, it can't be working.
No.
That's the thing. That, horrible though it is, if it had some rational side to it, one would not support it. I would never support such an operation, but you'd say at least try and understand what these people are doing. I mean, how can this possibly work? It's the notion is that, there's something semi-genetic about it.
Yes, and also this is pre-criminal space.
Yeah.
They haven't done anything. It's about whether you can catch people before they've done anything wrong. So actually, we've removed democratic space, and we've made pre-criminal space for those who have views that you have then decided are extreme.
And this
so dangerous. Yeah.
Very dangerous. And of course, the way it's being applied and used, we've seen amazing things going on.
Shocking.
I interviewed on this show, I'm trying to remember his name now, a very distinguished American legal scholar of Jewish origin, and anti-Zionist, who came to be interviewed and said, something happened in Britain which hasn't happened in the United States so far, that I was barred from speaking at 3 different...
Richard Falk.
Richard Falk.
Yes, the distinguished, who came to Beirut in 1982, that's where I met him, with the Sean McBride Commission of Inquiry, the great Sean McBride, co-writer of the Universal Declaration. He was part of the McBride Commission of Inquiry on the Israeli invasion. A very brave and distinguished lawyer.
Very brave and distinguished lawyer, not allowed to speak on 3 British campuses because his views were considered something or the other. They didn't
extreme.
Quite say extreme, but likely to provoke. Now, this is happening to people like that. And conferences on Israel-Palestine are being banned by some universities on the grounds that they are provocative. Something that never used to happen on university campuses in this country or elsewhere in Europe. So it's a strange, weird, murky that envelops a political culture
So
today.
you could say that there's a democracy for a certain class of people, because this legislation doesn't refer to them. They don't see it because they're not the target of it. For another class of people, people like us, yeah, Muslims, immigrants, refugees, they're no longer citizens, they're subjects. And it's that invisible where some citizens don't see that others are being treated in a non-democracy, in an authoritarian world, where another system is at play. And that's that invisible colonialism. That's where it is. So what's so murky about it is that a great many people can get on with their lives and think they're living in one country because it has nothing to do with them. And they think we've got to catch these dangerous people, the police are doing their best. And there's those who are the victim of this legislation and the targets, and they understand it very well. Yeah? And thank goodness there has been some campaigners who understand it as a basic infringement, because you and I would probably agree that if some people aren't free, none of us are free. So those kinds of campaigners that see if others are not being treated, you know, that's the opposite of democracy. So British values are being told that we have to defend British values rather than universal values. The European Convention would allow us the principles, the human rights that we should all be aspiring to. So if you replace it by British values, you're already giving a signal that the foreigner, the immigrant, the Muslim, does not yet have those values. Right? They're not universal values, they're British values. It's a colonial understanding to say these are British values. Democracy is a British value. Well, it's not being practiced, is it?
No, and of course people refuse to, or not most people, because what was very interesting in the recent election campaign in this country is after the terrorist attacks in Manchester, Jeremy Corbyn, for a political leader in this country, did something incredibly courageous. He, of course, denounced terrorism and denounced the attacks, but he then went on to say that the reason for these attacks, which are horrible, is British foreign policy in the Middle East. And the first reaction to this remark by Corbyn, including from within his own party, was shock, horror. They were trembling. He's taken a risk. We're going to be sunk in the elections. Because it was during the campaign, the Conservative leader Theresa May saying, we've got him now.
Yes.
We're going to campaign on the
Yes.
inability of Corbyn to defend British security, and the tabloids going mad. Within 48 hours, all this had stopped. Why? Because the private and public polls revealed that between 65 and 70% of the population agreed with Corbyn. So what this shows also is that when you have politicians speaking up courageously and honestly, people respond to it.
They're so grateful. They're so grateful for someone that represents their interests rather than tells them some terrifying fairy tale that is making them more scared. You know, the Manchester and these bombings, you know, this is criminal and loss of life, but people know there is something that's connecting these colonial and military adventures abroad.
They do know it.
With something at home. And so that someone can talk about it for them in the public sphere that can represent them, like Jeremy Corbyn could, and articulate this and say, let's address this. We need to address these injustices. Yeah? That is something that people want the right answers. This prevent legislation is making a more dangerous place for us. Not only does it not work, but it increases divisions. Now, if there's one thing we don't want to do, is increase those divisions. Yeah?
Karma, thanks very much.
Thank you.
It's been good talking with you.